Well, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Hinkle. I am the Program Manager and Technical Assistance Lead at the National Center on Educational Outcomes, formerly with the Ohio Department of Education. That's why we were giving out shout outs to the Ohio folks. And I'm here to welcome you all today to this webinar. As Virginia mentioned, this is essentially a follow-up to a previous webinar about student perceptions and perspectives on the selection of implementation of accommodations. That was very well received. And so we wanted to do this additional content on the teacher perspective. We're just thrilled to have all of you here. 64 people right now participating. It's a great turnout for us. And we just can't thank you enough for joining us for this hour and a half or so on this important and interesting topic. Our director, Dr. Cheryl Lazarus, is in transit doing some other work today and couldn't join us, but we have a little welcome video we would like to share with you. I know many of you already seen this, but there are some new people on here, so it just takes a couple minutes here. You can meet Cheryl.
Welcome to the National Center on Educational Outcomes, NCEO. Hi, I'm Cheryl Lazarus, and I'm the director of the center. NCEO focuses on the inclusion of students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities in instruction and assessment.
First funded in 1990, NCEO leads the way in advocating for appropriate testing, access, and accommodations for all students. Assessment is all about instruction. Assessment is a window for viewing instructional issues and needs. It is also a warning flag that lets us know when something needs to change in instruction. Curriculum, instruction, and assessment are three pillars that need to be in place for improved student outcomes, and NCEO is here to help. NCEO serves a number of audiences. Our primary audience is state departments of education, including special education, assessment, English language development, accountability, and curriculum offices in all 50 states and in the unique entities that receive U.S. special education funds. In addition, NCEO and its related projects provide technical assistance and information for policymakers, school leaders, educators, and parents and families. NCEO addresses accessibility issues on all tests across the comprehensive assessment system. These assessments range from the formative assessment practices and classroom-based assessments that teachers use to make minute-by-minute and day-by-day instructional decisions, to the interim assessments used to measure progress and potential learning loss, as well as summative tests that are often used for accountability purposes. NCEO also works to ensure that assessment results for students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities are reported just as they are for other students, and that the results influence accountability systems in the same way as they do other students. NCEO provides a wide range of resources on interim and diagnostics assessments, alternate assessments, accessibility and accommodations, reporting, and much more. It also develops professional development materials that states can share with their districts and schools. NCEO provides targeted and intensive technical assistance to states and entities on numerous topics about the inclusion of students with disabilities in comprehensive assessment systems. For more information, please visit NCEO online at www.nceo.info.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, if you are not previously familiar with NCO, we do encourage you to check out our website. We have many resources that you may find of interest. And follow us on social media. We're always disseminating new products as frequently as we can. So let me introduce you to our team. You've already met Virginia and myself. We also have Cassandra Fleming, Linda Goldstone.
Hello, everyone. Good to see new faces and familiar faces. Welcome.
There's Linda, Mari.
Hi.
And Chris Rogers. So that's our
Yeah.
team from NCEO today. This presentation is based on a brief that we published a couple months ago. That QR code will get you to the brief, and then we put the link into the chat. The goals today, we want to share some research findings on teacher perceptions of accommodations. So they'll explain how we did the research, but this is not just our observations. This is actually research-based findings. We then will recognize the importance of considering teacher perceptions and perspectives. And then at the end, we'll have some opportunity to discuss some strategies to apply these findings to the work of y'all, the SEAs, the state education agencies, parent centers, and potentially some of the local education agencies are on here. Note about a terminology. We use here at NCEO, we continue to use the term accommodations to refer to any kind of feature that provides access to a student on an assessment or during instruction, for that matter. We do this in part because the Individual with Disabilities Education Act and ESCA, are now known as ESSA, both refer to accommodations, but we acknowledge that many states have, since IDEA or ESCA or ESSA were reauthorized, that many states have moved to a tiered system of accessibility supports. And in fact, many, if not most states now use the term accessibility manual or accessibility on state tests, referring to that whole umbrella of features that provide access to our students with disabilities and English learners and English learners with disabilities. The research literature, however, continues to refer to accommodations. We found almost no research so far that refers to accessibility features. They always use the term accommodation. So for example, in many states, you might have highlighter as a universal tool for all of your students on your assessments now, but in the research and under IDEA and ESCA, they still refer that highlighter as an accommodation. So we continue to use the word accommodation, but we mean all accessibility features. So as mentioned, our guiding legislation, NCEO particularly, kind of serves two masters. We follow the Individual with Disabilities, Individual with Disabilities Education Act, our federal offices, the Office of Special Education Programs. But because we're assessment, we also follow under the ESSA and under the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And so this work that we do falls under both of those legislations as well. Yeah, and so particularly IDEA, our bread and butter, points out that all children with disabilities are included in general and district-wide assessment programs with appropriate accommodations, and that's what kind of leads where our topic today, and alternate assessments. So that's enough about that background. Turn it over to, I believe, Virginia to talk about the methodology.
So the research we're going to share with you today is on teacher perceptions and preferences of kind of how teachers experience accommodations and how their reaction and their biases and their background impact how they participate in the choosing of accommodations, how they assist students in accommodations. So we found a really good quote, and it was from one of the authors in the research that we read, that this is important because teachers tend to be the person between a student and an accommodation. They're the ones that make sure that students have access to the accommodation. They often are part of the decision making. They're the ones who teach the students to use the accommodation. So teacher perceptions and teacher attitudes about accommodations and accessibility are actually really important, and it's not something that we've talked about too much. So to do this work, we went back to our accommodations toolkit. And for those of you who are not familiar with the accommodations toolkit, the QR code on the slide will take you there. And it's organized by accommodation. So you can see what the research says about highlighter, about text to speech, about speech to text. And each one of those entries in the accommodations toolkit includes something about teacher perceptions when we were able to find data about how teachers viewed that particular accommodation. So we took all of that information and we put it into one brief so that you could see teacher accommodation perspectives and perceptions kind of across the accommodations and together in one place. So when you get to the brief, you'll see there's a table that shows you the different accommodations we looked at, how many research studies were available that had something about teacher perceptions, and then the findings that go with that accommodation. So the brief is organized with a table and then with strategies and suggestions after that. What was interesting when we looked at the research was how many or how few research studies actually included teacher perceptions and accommodations. So what we found between 1999 and 2022 was that at least 7 studies referred to teacher perceptions about assistive technology. Whereas if you look at some of the other ones, calculator, braille, tactile graphics has 2, calculator, braille, word prediction, text to speech. We only found very few studies that talked about teacher perceptions of those accommodations. And some of them are the most used accommodations, which is also interesting. So we went back to our student brief about student perceptions, and you can get to that one from this handy QR code as well. And when we compared them, it was interesting. We found that teacher perceptions were included in 44 of the studies that we looked at, and student perceptions were only included in 36 studies, which was a little surprising because we tend to talk about student perceptions more than we do teacher perceptions. The most frequently studied accommodation for teachers was assistive technology, whereas for students, we saw a lot of studies about text-to-speech and extended time and how students experienced those things. We weren't able to find any teacher perceptions, studies with teacher perceptions about highlighting, large print, magnification, noise reduction, paper format, or speech to text. So the literature, the research literature has some holes in it, is a big part of what we found. Turn it over to Mari.
Yeah, I'm going to share some of the positive impacts and challenges that this research found. So it did document the positive perceptions and experiences teachers have when making these accessibility decisions about what accommodations to use. But it also showed that there were challenges teachers faced when selecting and implementing the accommodations. So starting with some of the positive findings, there was an overall positive perception of accommodations. So teachers do see the usefulness and the benefits of the accommodations. Another positive thing was that teachers were able to identify areas where they need professional development related to accommodations. And we thought this was positive because it shows that teachers are able to recognize where they have gaps in their knowledge and in their training, and where it would be beneficial for them to get more professional development. And finally, it's positive finding that teachers are active members of IEP teams, which the IEP teams are the ones that make these accommodation decisions. So having teachers who know the students, know what they use in the classroom, it's really important that they are active members of the IEP teams, which was found to be the case. So in addition to these positive findings, the research also identified a number of challenges that teachers face. So one of the big ones, just overall finding, was that teachers recognized that it was challenging to make appropriate accommodation decisions. They don't always know what's going to be the best for the students, what's going to be manageable. And there were a few accommodations for which the decisions were especially difficult. First was assistive technology, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Second is oral delivery. So oral delivery has multiple formats like human reader, text to speech, recorded oral delivery, and making the decision about which of these delivery methods is most appropriate when it can be a really challenging decision. And then some of the others that were difficult for making accommodation decisions were student reads aloud to self, scribe, translation of test directions, and tactile graphics. So these were just a few specific ones that the research pointed out as being somewhat more challenging when teachers are making decisions. Another challenge is that teachers' philosophies and perceptions may influence what accommodations students have access to. So whatever the teachers' preferences are, or what they think is going to work best, is going to influence which accommodations they choose to assign to the student, which sometimes can be a challenge if it's not necessarily the most appropriate accommodation, but if it's instead the teacher's preference.
Right.
And then teachers would also identify that they'd benefit from additional training in selecting and implementing accommodations for students with high incidence disabilities specifically. So higher incidence disabilities include disabilities like specific learning disability, having other health impairments, or emotional disturbance. So for these students, this group of students, teachers found it especially challenging to select and implement the appropriate accommodations. And this is actually a point that we are going to talk about later on in the interactive part of this webinar.
Right.
So we did pull out a few quotations from the research studies because I think getting the words from the teachers themselves can be one of the most impactful pieces of the research. So these first two are both about assistive technology, with the first teacher saying, getting all the devices, or even most, to operate correctly, consistently, and efficiently is another dilemma. And then keeping them running and current is usually a huge bugaboo. So the teachers are having challenges getting these devices and the assistive technology that students need. They have trouble getting it up and running and making sure that it's current and that students don't have any issues when they're using it. And another teacher said one of the major hurdles of AT use is limited funding and ever-evolving new technologies. So as we all know, technology is moving at such a rapid pace, AI and just new devices all the time. And that can be really challenging to keep up with that for teachers, especially when there's limited funding. So schools might not be able to get the newest devices that are going to be most appropriate and most effective for students. So again, more about AT, which, as we saw also, there were a lot of studies on AT. That was the most studied for teacher perceptions out of these. One teacher said, in my opinion, more time and instruction needs to be spent in the training programs for teachers of students with visual impairments on some of the high-tech devices. And this quotation goes right along with this next one of, we are asked to teach AT, but are never given any textbooks or systematic methodology to do so. We have to look up tutorials online and try to adapt them to our students' needs. So teachers are not receiving this training ahead of time, and it's just increasing the burden on them. And we already know teachers are stretched so thin, and having them have to go out on their own, learn how to use these devices, learn how to teach them to the students is just adding additional barriers to students' access. So we're going to do just a little bit of a deeper dive into a few selected accommodations and what teachers' perceptions were of these. So starting with human read aloud, found that most teachers preferred text-to-speech, but some general education teachers perceived human reader or human read aloud to be useful. This goes with the challenge we identified earlier of making difficult decisions about which method of delivery for oral delivery is the best. And we can see that teacher preferences are different and they might affect which delivery method is chosen. Special education teachers generally found professional development on making decisions about the use of human read aloud accommodation useful. Again, earlier we mentioned that teachers have identified that they have this need for professional development, and this finding shows that professional development really is useful. Teachers are getting something out of that. So looking at signed administration, teachers reported that professional development was needed on how to translate test directions and items to ensure that there are no changes to the test content. So some accommodations like signed administration pose a slight risk to things like test security or to the validity of test results when someone like a signed administrator has to be there and have access to the test, and they have to make sure that they are not changing any of the meaning, which can be really challenging with signed administration. And so teachers need the professional development on how to ensure that they're not changing that content. Teachers also reported concerns that signed administration can take more time for administration of the test than the schedules allow. And so this comes back to being sort of a system challenge of if there's just not enough time, it makes it really difficult to ensure the access for students who need the signed administration or other accommodations like this that may add additional time to their testing. Finally, we'll finish with scribe and test breaks. So with scribe, teachers believe they need additional training on making decisions about how to select and implement the scribe accommodation. This is another accommodation where an additional individual needs to be directly involved in the test administration. And so that's an area that there really needs to be good training on to make sure that there's no outside influences on the test or the test results. And finally, for test breaks, teachers generally perceive test breaks to be useful, especially for students with emotional, attention, or concentration issues, as well as for students with challenges related to fatigue and frustration. So here, teachers have identified specific groups that seem to especially benefit from the test breaks.
Thanks, Mari. All right.
Yeah, so we're going to share just a couple strategies. And in this, we also have a couple of videos from the NCEO has created that might be useful. So the first, we're just talking about this, but is to involve all teachers in accessibility and accommodations decision making. So including both general and special educators' perspectives, which as we just noted might be very different. Solicit their input for IEP team meetings. And this again also is going to include the parents and the families, as we just pointed out as well. It's important to understand teacher biases as these might influence their perceptions and what they suggest for making selections, and also to use state guidelines or other frameworks for decision making.
Okay. So we're ready for a video.
Why don't we start with introductions? As you all know, I'm Jerry Johnson, and I'm the school principal here.
I'm Danielle Adams, Emma's special education teacher.
I'm Emma.
I'm Kathy Rogers, Emma's mother. Lisa Coleman, Emma's math teacher.
The purpose of this meeting is to talk about accommodations that may help Emma during classroom instruction. We also want to prepare for the state test in the spring. It's good that we're meeting early to get this all sorted out.
I agree. I spoke with Emma last week about her classes. She said she's having particular difficulty with math this year, even though she's been a good math student in the past. We talked about accommodations that might help her during math. Emma, do you want to share what we talked about?
Like listening to my math book?
Exactly.
We talked about listening to my math book on the computer, and I want to do that.
So Lisa and I have been working together on this, and she's working on ordering an audio version of the text.
So you said this is an accommodation. How would that work?
Well, Emma would be able to listen to an audio version of the text in her math book. This may help her to understand better. Some of the math vocabulary in the textbook is difficult, and we don't want that interfering with Emma's learning.
Yeah, we've also talked about possibly providing a read-aloud accommodation during classroom tests. So what would this look like? Well, a paraprofessional or a resource teacher like Danielle would read the test questions to Emma aloud. We could try this on her weekly quizzes.
Then we would collect data to see if the accommodation is working. How does everyone feel about this? We could try reading the test items aloud on her math quizzes to see if it works.
I think we should try. What do you think, Emma?
Okay.
We should keep this accommodation in mind as we think about the upcoming state test. Also, I know that the read-aloud accommodation is permitted on the mathematics assessment.
Thanks, Virginia. So this video just highlighted sort of everyone having their input and working together to select the best accommodation for Emma, getting her input, the teacher's input, and really explaining to the parent what is happening and what this accommodation will do.
Why don't we start with introductions?
Sorry.
May help her to understand.
So
Technical difficulties.
Our second strategy is to provide professional development on assistive technology and other technology-based accommodations. So as we've talked about a lot, AT poses a lot of challenges for teachers and for students. So training is really needed on selecting and using assistive technology and specialized accommodations. Teachers need to be able to teach students and others, including families potentially, how to use them. So it's important that they're given this training so they don't have to learn it on their own time and just add to all that they're already doing. And then with this, teachers need to consider students' preferences about accommodation. So we saw this in the video as well. They're asking Emma how she felt about receiving her math textbook via oral delivery and getting her input on whether that accommodation is one that will work for her.
Good.
And our third strategy is to gather information on how accessibility features and accommodations worked. They mentioned this in the video as well. They're going to try it on a quiz and then see how that works, reflect back on it, and see if it made an impact. So it's important to evaluate accessibility and accommodations decisions at the student, school, and district levels, to collect feedback from teachers and students on the decision-making process. So thinking about whether they felt heard, what the discussions were like. Then collect feedback from teachers and students on the effectiveness of accommodation. So it's important after it's been implemented to see, did it work? Did the student and teacher enjoy it? Did it help the student? And then using feedback to inform policies and practices. So we have one more video showing some strategies.
Usually we show, there's another video if you're interested. This one is with the two teachers talking after the assessment. There's another video that is also really good to talk about gathering feedback from the student. And so there's another video with the special education teacher talking to the student. But since we're focusing on teacher perceptions here, we're going to watch the one with the general education teacher.
Hey, Lisa.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. Come on in.
So I wanted to let you know, I spoke with Emma, and she loves the read aloud accommodation for her classroom math tests, and she said she understands the questions better. I just wanted to see if her test scores have gone up.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, let's take a look at that. Let me pull up her quiz scores graph here. 1 second. Wow, I'd say that this is encouraging. Her performance has improved over time. If you look at this 9-week period here, her performance has improved greatly.
And it looks like even though her scores have gone up gradually, they've improved at a greater rate when she's been applying the read aloud accommodation. It seems like it's really helping.
Yeah, it's awesome.
When we put all that together and start thinking about what this means for our practice and our work, state policies, local policies, we need to start thinking, what kinds of actions can we take? And we want to make sure that we know that we're including teacher and student perspectives when we're gathering data about accommodations, what works, what doesn't work, including general and special educators in the decision-making process. And, I know that we know that's important, but making it happen is difficult. So if you think about some of the strategies of maybe gathering data from the general education teachers ahead of time, if they can't make it to the IEP meeting, but ensuring that they're part of the feedback loop and that they're part of the decision-making process. We need to make sure teachers are knowledgeable about student needs and what accommodations are available to meet those needs. Teachers need to advocate for their professional development needs. We see it in the research. There's a lot of spaces where teachers feel like there's holes in their knowledge. They have some understanding, but they don't know how to work a device, or they have to spend time finding out about a device. These kinds of things are things that districts can be providing to teachers and ensuring that they have the professional development they need and the practice with the equipment if they're using something like an assistive technology. Professional development is needed for many of the accommodations. Particularly, we saw that professional development is needed for assistive technology, color contrast, understanding what that is, when it works, who it benefits. Human read aloud, scribe. Scribe is difficult because of the importance in maintaining the validity of the assessment. Read aloud. Signed administration has some validity issues as well. All those kinds of things, teachers want to know that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and that the test is still going to be valid if they when they act as a scribe, because they're doing it according to whatever the guidelines are. So professional development, that's a big lesson out of this research. Encourage teachers to engage students in decision-making and reflecting on accommodations. So that's one of the videos we didn't watch, but there's a great video where they talk to Emma about how the read aloud accommodation went on her math assessment and how she experienced it. And she kind of reveals that she was a little distracted in the room that she was in. And that little bit of feedback will help them to apply the accommodation and use the accommodation better for the next assessment. So sharing that kind of reflection and feedback with the IEP team or with other teachers and families, having discussions about how things went is going to help encourage folks to make improvements and keep refining their processes. And that brings us to questions.